Welcome, everyone. We're really grateful and thrilled that you are able to join us this afternoon. Hope you and your families all had wonderful Thanksgiving celebrations. It is an uncharacteristically bright, sunny, crisp, beautiful day here in South Bend. The campus is beautiful and pristine and quiet as all the students pretty much have returned home for this long 10-week break. We feel very grateful for having completed a full semester. And while it was eventful at points along the way, there's a sense of deep accomplishment that we were able to keep in school classes and keep the full student body together amidst all of the challenges presented by this pandemic. Planning is intensive right now as we begin to prepare for the next semester to begin, which will be on February 3rd. Many students will be engaged in internships and 3 weeks of classes that we have pulled together for the month of January, where they can take 1 credit up to 3 credit classes to supplement their education. So it's an exciting time on campus as we enter the Advent season. It's a time of hope, and it's a time for prayer and reflection as we await the birth of Christ. It's my distinct pleasure today to welcome a new dean, the dean of the School of Architecture. He's been with us for a little over 5 months. His name is Stefanos Polyzoides. At the end of this interview, we're going to do a test with you to see who can pronounce his name best. He is the Francis and Kathleen Rooney Dean of the School of Architecture. He just joined the school, as I mentioned at the beginning of this school year. He's born in Athens, Greece, and Stefanos earned both his bachelor's and master's degree in architecture and urban planning at Princeton University, and he has lived and practiced architecture since 1973 in Southern California. So it was quite a coup to recruit him from Southern California to come and join us here in South Bend, Indiana. His areas of expertise include American domestic architecture, the professional practice of architecture, residential design, sustainable architecture and urbanism, and urban design, history, and theory. So, Stefanos, it is an honor and a pleasure to have you join us today. And why don't you begin and give us the correct, since I'm sure I butchered it, pronunciation to Polyzoides, and if there's any catch way to remember how to pronounce your last name.
Well, the right pronunciation is Polyzoides, but the easiest way to remember is that my name is Stefanos, and that's the way to address me.
Okay, fantastic. So the first question that I have, Stefanos, is do you have to be a Greek American to be the dean of the College of Architecture at Notre Dame? You're following the long tenure of Michael Lakoutis, and we know that Greek architecture is steeped in this classical, wonderful traditions. But some of us who come from an Italian background feel a little slighted here, and the Romans have contributed a little bit to architecture as well. So tell us a little bit about your Greek background and how this led to your passion for architecture.
Well, I'm not sure about policies of this kind at Notre Dame. It's kind of extraordinary, actually, that this happened. It's very unusual because I'm not sure there are more Greek or Greek American architects or green-born architects who are practicing and teaching in the United States. It's a very unusual circumstance. I was born in Greece and lived there for 19 years before I came to study in Princeton. And I became an architect, I think, because I witnessed, while I was growing up, one of the great ironies of our civilization, which is the way in which post-World War II world economic development and culture ended up appending local cultures in a very violent way. So the people are, Greece was a developing country in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and along with access to health and education and prosperity of all kinds, people literally gave up their built heritage and ended up destroying the city they were living in and scarring nature around it. And I didn't have to be more than 10 years old to figure out that what was going on was actually not right, that the city being built and the world being structured was not even half as good as the one being destroyed. So that piqued my interest. And as a human being, I was always more interested in questions than in answers. I was more interested in tales and interminable searches than in coming up with a singular question that would resolve every issue. And architecture really is a tale without end. It comes from someplace, it's going someplace, and one has to write it on its own terms to execute it in the best ways possible.
Well, that's fascinating. So from a very young age, you developed a passion for architecture and urban design, and growing up in Greece. Tell us, what did it take for Notre Dame to be able to recruit you from a very successful practice and also a great teaching career for many years at USC prior to that, to recruit you to come out and be dean here at Notre Dame?
Well, it actually took very little because I was so very focused at the end of my professional career on the subject of what remained to be done. And what remained to be done, as far as my generation is concerned, is really to take the strategies that the School of Architecture had developed over the last 30 years on classical education and also on classicism as a design strategy, and actually making them more popular, more accepted, and more legitimate in the end by exposing them to more and more students, both the undergraduate and the graduate level, and influencing the country as a whole through thoughts, through writings, and through deeds to pursue this course, which I believe is the precise and most important course to follow in order to make up for the rather extreme destruction worldwide that industrial and post-industrial development has wrought on cities and the countryside over the last, say, 80 years. Mm-hmm. And this is the kind of destruction that you see in census American suburbs, in sprawl, for instance. You can see it in the coming in and out of South Bend in this very ugly corridors. You can see it in the difference between the center of Rome or Paris and the edges of Rome and Paris, where you can't believe you're in the same country or in the same world. So we have an intense process of reconstruction in front of us, and this process of reconstruction cannot be addressed by the 20 or 30 or 50 architects like me who've been trying to promote and practice this over the last 30 years. It has to be done by a cast of thousands. And the only way to put a cast of thousands to this cause is to actually lead this school to ever greater prominence and persuade others to chase the same goals.
Let's stick on that theme for a little bit, Stefanos. And many would look at architecture and say, okay, it's a relatively small school within a larger university, and that the only people who deeply care about architecture are architects. How can you really spread the word to have kind of a broader appeal of the role of architecture in urban design, so that the average Joe and Jane can understand its impact and importance? How much is that what motivates you and drives you, and how do you disseminate that message?
It's an excellent question. This is not a question about the average person. It's a question about very sophisticated people. For instance, when I arrived at the university, not surprisingly, everybody, including my fellow deans and people at the upper echelons of administration and colleagues in other departments, thought of architecture as the art of making buildings, which is not an unreasonable definition, actually. But it is much more than that, because although it has been taught in the last um, 50 years, say, as the art of making individual buildings by and large by schools of architecture and described as such by schools of art and so on, it is much, much more than that, in that the most profound influence and importance of architecture is in the way it structures the world. And naturally, it structures the world in a house or in an institution like the School of Architecture or on a campus like Notre Dame. It certainly does that. But it does a lot more than that. It, building to building, place to place, neighborhood by neighborhood, district by district, it begins to structure the entire urban environment in which we live. And because it also controls through the locational qualities of buildings against each other, the space between buildings, so the public realm, whether it's free or not free, or beautiful or protected or unprotected, and so on, all of those kinds of things affect the way human beings live. Think of the difference between living in an uncertain place in South America or in a highly controlled and open place in the United States, for instance, in terms of public space. And then it also affects, by its overall arrangement across a region, it affects how we circulate. It affects the kind of mobility that we use, means of mobility to come around, and therefore determines whether we commute in the end, through the means we choose to circulate, whether we commute 1 hour and 1.5 hours each way, or whether we walk to work, like I often do from my apartment to the campus. And then by its overall rate and character of and control over growth, it also affects direly nature, and not only forest versus city, but also quality of air, quality of water. Now, you might say all of those things are by far more complex than the making of a single building. Yes, but in the end, architecture needs to be understood as the source, as the seed that, when aggregated, begins to generate both the most glorious and wonderful things about our lives, the way we feel comfortable, the way we feel protected, the way we feel that our family life and our institutional life and our religious life and every aspect of our life is fulfilled, right? It's supported. But at the same time, it really does this in a way that involves everyone else, and not only us, not only our circle, our personal or familiar circle. And therefore, if it's out of control, it's out of whack, which it currently is, and worldwide. I mean, we've all have traveled, and we've seen the nature of cities, particularly in the developing world. It's the first time in the history of civilization that this kind of crisis has arisen, whether it's global warming or not. The urban crisis itself is extreme. And therefore, you have to understand, all of us have to understand, that the only way to respond and to address this crisis is in the same way the crisis was generated. You undo the world one move at a time, you put it together one move at a time. So we face a very interesting challenge, in that we have to start teaching architecture as an ameliorative art, as the art of interfering, not for the glory of any one person or any one institution or any one place, but in a cause that has to do with structuring our entire world, and, as I've said many times, maybe with some exaggeration, saving the world, because that in the end is our cause.
With that broad understanding and definition of architecture, how could one not be passionate about architecture and understand its impact? I ran a homeless center for a little over 8 years, and one of the things I came to understand that much of the fundamental work in working with those in poverty and those who living on the margins was you had to begin by resuscitating hope, helping people to believe that the change was indeed possible. And the first way that you did that was through the physical environment in which they found themselves.
Yeah.
And you think about it, you walk on the campus of Notre Dame, you cannot help but feel renewed by the beauty of this campus, the spirit. There's a sense of hope, possibility. It expands your horizons. When you go into an inner city, in many cases, with projects and it's run down, I don't care who you are, it brings down your self-esteem and has a huge impact about how you think about the world and yourself. So the impact is universal. Tell us a little bit about your initial, after 5 months here, your initial impressions about Notre Dame as an institution and about the School of Architecture in particular.
Well, at 5 months and a few days, my impressions are partial, but they're fresh and therefore good. Um, I found a School of Architecture that I expected to be very friendly and very warm, but I was surprised by how hardworking people were, how they felt as if they were a singular faculty body, rowing all in the same direction, which was unprecedented in my academic experience, and also how dedicated they were to their students. And I'm sure we'll be talking about the pandemic following this question, but it was particularly clear the sense of self-sacrifice and the sense of deep interest in the workings of the school. I found the school expertly managed, extraordinarily efficient. I couldn't believe how beautifully managed the school was by a staff that is also extremely dedicated. And I have to tell you, I decided to take this job, and you interviewed me, and a number of other people interviewed me, as you remember. And I decided to take this job based on these interviews because I realized that there was a certain kind of intimacy, a certain kind of soul to this institution that that promised a great deal in supporting my interests and the interests of the school to head in the direction that it needs to be in the next 50 years. And so I've been also very surprised because I was not expecting really anything in how the university would treat me. I've been welcomed. I've been welcomed to an extraordinary degree, and I've been supported to an extraordinary degree. And the thing that has surprised me, and I feel very proud of, is that there is a sense of family in this institution that is amazing, and there is a sense of future in this institution which is very unusual because Notre Dame is already a very distinguished institution, right? It's a very distinguished place of learning that does not need to be necessarily so oriented to the future with a kind of passion it's oriented towards the future, because it's not oriented to the future to capture it, it's oriented to the future to receive it and to process it in the most positive way. So I couldn't believe how oriented this university is to excelling and to going beyond itself to a world of excellence that is virtually unknown. And I'm very excited to be part of it. The leadership circle is very small. The discussions have been very intimate because the deans, instead of meeting once a month, are meeting twice a week because of the COVID emergency. So there is a lot of steady hands at the governance of this process, and it's been an altogether great learning experience for me, and far beyond anything I had ever expected. I'm very, very proud to be here.
That's wonderful and affirming, certainly, to hear. But let's get a little bit to what you alluded to, the pandemic. You come in at an incredibly challenging time here. And how has the pandemic, from your perspective, affected the life of architecture students and faculty? And it's a discipline that is not easily taught online as it might be with some other themes or areas. But how have students and faculty adjusted? And do you see the pandemic having a lasting impact on the profession of architecture and how you might do it differently going forward?
Well, the first thing about this pandemic is setting forth to be in it, to live through it with the right attitude. I was very fortunate to be very well prepared in that I grew up during a post-World War period, and civil war and world war in Greece, in which there was no pandemic, but there was a crisis for almost all the years that I lived there. And so I recognized immediately during the pandemic that working and living under duress is an opportunity because it brings people together. It asks them to reach to resources they didn't know they had, and it spurs a kind of propensity to cooperation and to care and to support of each other. And so from the beginning, I try to, through communications and direct contact with the students, I just try to impress on them that whatever difficulties they were living through, and the difficulties were very intense, isolation, social isolation because they couldn't get close to their peers, exhaustion from looking at screens 8 or 10 hours a day, those kinds of things, living apart, all of those were very, very difficult things, sometimes being exposed and having to live in even further isolation. I just tried to explain to them that all of this was a small price to pay compared to the discipline of learning under the most difficult circumstances, which then would allow the learning through less disciplined circumstances to become an easier and more natural task. They've done very well. They've done exceptionally well, and I'm very proud of them. On the day-to-day operational part, I can't possibly tell you how complicated it has been. The School of Architecture has had to separate all of its studios at 6 feet, which means every living space in the whole school, including corridors, the stoa, everything is full of desks. People cannot gather in appropriate numbers for courses, so courses have had to be taught some remotely and some in person. And then when people got sick, people had to, professors had to teach in person and teach 2 people remotely. That kind of flexibility, that kind of care, that kind of interest in the students was absolutely universal within the school. And I didn't hear a single word of complaint out of 32 faculty members. 3 faculty members came from Italy, left their families behind to come and teach in the school. 1 or 2 of them doing great sacrifice. And then the staff was beyond extraordinary, because any little thing that went wrong, any just little thing within the school, they were always there. They were always taking care of things. And of course, the emergency was on top of regular operations. So they were doing their job 1.5 times, because the job of running a school is the job of running a school under all circumstances. So I'm in awe of what has been accomplished. I think it's a national model, what the university has been able to do. Unfortunately, we had the press concentrate and focus on the wrong things this past fall. But what we've done is so extraordinary that I think it needs to be acknowledged as a major accomplishment, and as a possible way for the whole country to follow up on the issue of how to live in a pandemic.
Well, it's great that I noticed that your alma mater, Princeton, just announced that they're going to, while they had been in remote classes this past semester, will welcome back their full student body in the winter-spring semester. So perhaps there has been a bit of an influence of the Notre Dame example, and I think we made it through this past semester first and foremost because our students really, really wanted to be here.
Yeah,
they did not want remote education. They wanted to be with one another. They wanted the full Notre Dame experience, and more than anything else, that's what helped us to carry us through. So you've mentioned that you believe very boldly that architecture can change the world. That's a bold proclamation, and one I find fascinating. So tell us a little bit more about how you hope to affect that change through the Notre Dame School of Architecture.
Well, I want to say a few things about the history of architectural education, because I think it's important for the participants in this call to understand that these are not extreme and unusual ideas. But my hope is to be able to reconstitute architectural education as it used to be before 1945. What has happened to architecture is that, for reasons that have to do, I think, mostly with the attachment of individual architects to ever greater connection with those that sponsor their buildings. Architecture has lost its larger umbrella concern and its larger umbrella constituency with a broader view of design, and it is really very narrowly associated with the making of single buildings, whether it's for institutions, but mostly for industry, for commerce, and for housing, really, essentially. Before the Second World War, schools of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning were under one umbrella, under one deanship even very often. So the simplest way to describe how to reconstitute um, architecture in a way, as a discipline, in a way that addresses the changes that we need in the world, is to just include in the body of instruction the understanding of the making of buildings in a context. So nothing of what I'm saying is going to affect how we think about designing single buildings, because obviously a single building is really the seed of everything that makes our life possible as human beings. But then to instruct students in how to understand this building affecting the nature of the place in which it's inserted, whether it's historic core of Rome or a new commercial district or some awful place in the suburbs or a favela in Brazil, that building has to be designed with the interest in addressing the urban structure and change in the urban structure in every one of these places on its own terms. And then if you connect to that the idea that we don't only live in a culture where people have individual needs and have developed individual ways of living, acting, working, entertaining themselves, etc., but we also live in diverse kinds of nature. That if you are in a tropical environment, if you are living in a desert, if you're living in a cold climate, if you're living in anywhere on the world, you have to deal with the specifics of where you are and be designing buildings where you are, not only from a flora and fauna point of view, not only from a conservation point of view, but also from an energy and living in a balanced way in this kind of place. So it would not take very much, I think, to take the excellent work that's been done to date in the School of Architecture and the design of buildings, and in the design of buildings in place, and to enlarge the urbanist dimension of education, and to enlarge the landscape dimension of education, and begin to see the school, instructing in a more inclusive, in a more summary way of the kind that existed previously. So the students leaving the school can not only dedicate themselves to various tasks that are different than just designing buildings, but also when designing buildings, they can advise and lead and advocate with their clients, do the right thing. And the right thing is, one of the other things I admire about the school and the university has to do with the fact that moral character matters, and choosing who you work for and how you advocate is very important. And of course, choosing your clients is also very important, because service really in architecture is about working for everybody, not only for your primary client. And so those two things together, plus the transformation of the program in a more aggressively cohesive and integrated way, I think might begin to render the kinds of architects we need in this world and in this country. Could take 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years, doesn't matter. But we're putting the seeds in place that will reconstitute the profession of architecture in a more whole way.
Your vision is inspiring, Stefanos, and it makes me want to be an architect, and I can see how it would attract many others to the school. One of the distinctive characteristics of an architecture degree at Notre Dame is the focus on classicism and traditionalism. How is that not a limiting factor? How does that inspire all the work that you do, and why do you think that's an important characteristic for Notre Dame education in architecture?
That's a very complex question, but I'll try to answer it in a short time. The first thing is that there is the issue, the bigger issue, the umbrella issue of a classical education, and I want to differentiate that from an interest in classicism. A classical education is an education that allows people to be exposed to as comprehensive a view of the world as exists or has existed as possible. For instance, it'll shock you to know that most schools of architecture don't teach history. So an architect who wants to design high-rise buildings might never have studied or been in a French Gothic cathedral, which is the pinnacle of verticality in the history of the world. They don't study typology. They don't study how city halls evolve over time. Most architectural instruction begins after 19, with precedence after 1920. Modernists are very short-sighted in that view of the world and in what they consider important. And our position is that we need to look at the past comprehensively. But it's not only knowing where we're coming from and to know where we're going from a historical point of view that makes sense. I think we have to have a much more open-minded sense about how technology operates in the world or has operated in the past. One of the capital sins of the last 80 years has been that we've pretended that steel and glass is going to solve the problem of the world, the problems of the world, and concrete. These technologies are polluting, they're expensive, they're unavailable to most people in the world. They are also not environmentally very, very, very positive. And when you go into a beautiful town anywhere in the world that's made of stone, and you begin to see the horrible things that are happening with people adding in forms and traditions and violating traditions, then you realize that what we need to be talking about in schools of architecture is how to certainly deal with the new technology and the future that's coming in certain ways. But at the same time, that instruction should under no circumstances take us away from the notion of also respecting, knowing about, and continuing the traditions of the world for the benefit particularly of the poor and the ones that are badly resourced. Because if 10% of the world can deal with steel and glass, 90% cannot. And sometimes dealing with adobe and thatch, in an African village is a much preferable way from every point of view of setting up a living than a bad, a bad building made of leftover materials from some urban, abandoned site. So that's half of the question of tradition, making sure you understand what the world has been and what its advantages and disadvantages, its glories and its warts actually are. The other one is the question of classicism. And I would say it's not only a question of classicism, it's also a question of vernacularism, because vernacularism is a movement by which we've built the most beautiful common places known to the world, the villages of Provence, the Greek islands, the villages and towns of North Africa, wonderful suburban areas of South Bend, pre-1940. These are all vernacular architectural accomplishments. Now, the word is a little bit loose because obviously in South Bend we had architects doing many of these. But nonetheless, people who cared about being invisible, and doing things simply and deliberately, but small and caring about the whole place. So vernacularism is very important. We want to start teaching that again in depth. But classicism is also important because not only because of its Greco-Roman sources, which are sometimes exaggerated, but because of its worldwide reach. In every culture, there is a classical tradition, which I think means to most people in common language, a meaning of a culture of meaning and perfection, a culture that incorporates the highest level of resolution of the social, cultural, environmental, psychic, religious, every possible dimension of human life in the finest sense. You can think about the temples of Kyoto, or the Pantheon in Rome, or some magnificent building by McKee Maiden White in New York, the University Club. All of them incorporate in their own ways the most perfect way of dealing with architecture as we've known it since the beginning of time. Now, are we teaching people to become architects who are necessarily vernacularists and classists? I'm not sure everybody in the School of Architecture would agree on this, but my personal view is that we are not. We're teaching people how to be architects. We reach the point of understand and be taught how to be Frank Lloyd Wright, how to be a genius, and to undo everything around you based on what you think is your architecture, your way of doing things. We think that the most important way of instructing architects is to give them a sense about what is the most perfect way that architecture has ever been made, and then to let them judge for themselves how they're going to operate within it. Some of them will be classicists, some of them would be vernacularists house builders and designers. Others may become flaming modernists, best for them. But they will know how to possibly structure their buildings in a way that reflects these extraordinary traditions of the world. Keep in mind, for the ones who are interested in architecture, that by far the best modernist buildings, by far the best, are the ones of the pioneers of modern architecture, of Le Corbusier, of Frank Lloyd Wright, of Aalto, of Mies van der Rohe, of Walter Gropius, all of whom, every single one of whom, was classically trained. But when you take the classical training away, what you're left with is virtually nothing other than technology and ego. And that is no way of teaching anybody how to design in the world today.
No, that's a very helpful and excellent explanation. Tell us a little bit about another distinctive characteristic of Notre Dame education. It's a 5-year degree for undergrads to get a degree in architecture. In the 3rd year, you must study abroad in the wonderful facilities that we have in that great city of Rome. What is your vision about that component of the educational program, but also the global vision that you have for our architectural students and the impact that we can have as a school?
Well, first of all, I think having a school in Rome is nothing short of a miracle. Because keep in mind, we're not a program in Rome, we're a school. Mm-hmm. We have 10 faculty members and our whole 3rd year class there every single year. With the exception of this one, hopefully the students will go there in the summer for a special program. But why do it? I think Rome is the most beautiful city in the world for one single reason. And that is that it has been cared for architecturally since the beginning of time. Mm-hmm. And even its ruins project that kind of presence and care. But for at least since the primacy of the Catholic Church for almost 10 centuries, the city has been cared for very deliberately, architecturally and urbanistically. And some of the greatest architects in the world have taken part in this, and painters and sculptors and so on have taken care to be part of this fine interpretation of architecture into magnificent places and buildings. And then the vernacular city is also organized around these monuments in a way that the public space of the city, and by extension, the life of the city, is so complex and so tangible and so exciting that that the students can be inspired by it. I don't think that Italians are loquacious and extroverted because they were born loquacious and extroverted. People don't get born with that kind of character. They are made that way by the world in which they live. And therefore, Italians are this way, and Mediterranean people in general, because they inherited this magnificent set of cities in which they can operate with abandon according to their human nature. And therefore, setting our students in, many of them having grown up in the suburban United States, is an opportunity for them to understand this issue, not to be brainwashed to think they're going to come back and make Rome in rural Indiana, but to really understand how buildings and public space can change the world, how a magnificent church can fortify your faith, how a beautiful house can make your family more happy and connected, how a magnificent street can bind you to your neighbors. So that's the reason why we send them to Rome. And what we plan to do with this, there are a number of very important issues that we need to discuss also about how the school learns by doing. I think that's a very important dimension, that we need to stop thinking of ourselves as being under attack because we're the only classes in the country, in the world, teaching classicism, but to think that the time has come for us to plant our flag and turn inside out and say, well, here we come. And the here we come has a Notre Dame South Bend dimension, and that we should be able to take care more of the issues of our city and our region and so on. But it also means that because we're so profoundly landed in Rome, that we can actually set up an institution there that begins to address Italy, Europe, Africa and Asia in very much the same way a three-continent political institution. In the same way, we can think of our presence there in our architecture and our care to deal with the world as being giving us access to all these places. Notre Dame already has a gateway, a building in Jerusalem, and one, I believe, in one in Jerusalem, I think. And there are faculty members in Rome that are working in Jericho in Morocco. So I'm hoping that this initiative becomes a Mediterranean initiative that also begins to tie together these very diverse cultures from all over that region. But the one thing I want to say, which is very important, Lou, is, and I'm very critical very often of how Americans and Europeans have actually exported the culture in the world and have made local people very uncertain about the worth of their culture and have created, in many ways, social and environmental problems that are dire. And I think our role should be not to outreach for the sake of promoting ourselves or our ideas. I think we should outreach to serve, and to serve primarily by respecting the cultures of those we come in contact with and helping them to understand why what they have is by far more important than what we can give to them. And the only gift we can convey to them is confidence in accepting who they are. And I think that for me, in summary, is the task of the next 100 years, is to let the world become diverse and to distinguish itself on its own terms.
I have three final questions here, Stefanos, and we have a limited amount of time. So the first one, tell us about the graduate program, which is relatively new in the School of Architecture. What's your vision for it, and how can you make it a distinctive Notre Dame education?
Well, let me say I'll start from a rather prosaic point, which I think is important nonetheless, and that is that there's no great school of architecture in the United States or the world that does not have a great graduate school, because for a number of reasons. One of them is that great graduate schools attract the best minds in the country. There's always a very limited number of people who want to do anything in this country. Maybe 200, 300, 500 people are the cream of the crop of people who wish to study certain things. Well, we have no access to these people because the most ancient institutions on our land and schools of architecture have enough money and enough organization under their belt that they can attract them, give them full scholarships, and they all go to half a dozen East Coast schools basically to study architecture. And we get extremely capable and well-meaning students, but not the best students in the land. And I think we have to diversify our body of students by getting some first-class students, and we can do this only if we had access to a more organized and a more prosperously pulled together graduate program. So the graduate program is essential for the reputation of the school. It needs to be enlarged. It needs to be restructured to bring more world-famous architects to whom we have access because of the Driehaus Prize and the Manzano Prize, which are very tightly associated with the school. These are the two most important prizes in the world for classical and traditional architecture. Driehaus worldwide, Manzano in the Iberian Peninsula. And we're, as I said, very well connected to both of those. And with probably access to some extraordinary architects who come teach with us. So how to rethink the teaching of architecture at that level, how to get the best possible people to teach it, along with our current staff, particularly distinguished practitioners, how to include architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism in one program, which does not exist anywhere in the country, and how to build a body of students, maybe we have now 20, 25, how to make them 50 or 60, in such a way so that we get a much deeper level of research by having the students work with our faculty. So we actually fortify the research dimension of our school, and also put forth very aggressively and very successfully these teaching opportunities, this teaching by doing opportunities, both in a region and in Rome. So all of these things are interconnected, but the School of Architecture has to have a first-class graduate program in the next 5 years, and we're well on our way, actually, of getting it done.
Fantastic. Your vision isn't just global, Stefanos, but I know that it's all about partnerships, and including local partnerships. And recently, you have partnered with the city of South Bend. Tell us a little bit about that initiative.
Well, much of my practice in private practice over the last 25 years, 30 years, has been as a principal of the Congress for the New Urbanism, as a partner in a small firm in Pasadena. And we've done, the Congress of the New Urbanism resuscitated the idea of building cities in this country, restructuring the center of cities, and maybe starting the process of conserving nature. And you can see, for instance, in South Bend that the restriping of the streets, of the arterial roads, the Eddy Street Commons, the beautiful new work on campus, totally contrary to what's going on in the rest of most of the rest of the campus in the country where they're being undone one building at a time. These things are all part of a movement that has tried to reintroduce the notion of good management and beauty and consequential design in architecture and urbanism. I've been practicing in this area for quite a while. So when I arrived in South Bend and I saw South Bend in its current state, it occurred to me that there needed to be a much greater amount of care in how the university addresses South Bend. It took me months, as I should have done, I did, to find out why this has happened. There are historical reasons that go back generations, actually. But recently, there's been a lot of extraordinary quiet work, much of it not known. I'm actually kind of astonished by the humility by which many in the university have actually addressed the question of South Bend. And a lot of things are going on there, but they're not very visible. And from an environmental and architectural point of view, I felt that it's important for the School of Architecture to intervene in a very powerful way, not aggressively doing something by ourselves, but by being invited by the city and by extension by economic interests and by the neighborhoods. And so we've been asked by the city of South Bend to do two charrettes, one on the rather frayed William Street corridor in the west part of downtown, connecting the near west neighborhoods with downtown, and one around the clover leaf at the farmers market at the base of Eddy Street at the bridge. And we'll do that next semester. We're doing it with faculty and students a week before the semester starts as a collaborative exercise. It brings the students to work on a real project for a real client and working as equals with their faculty, which is a remarkable experience. And I hope that the university in the years to come addresses itself not only to South Bend, but also to Mishawaka and Elkhart, and continues its region as being a part of its identity and of its presentation as well. Because I want you to know that there is no great university in the United States that doesn't have a town gown pair. You know, think of Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Virginia, Berkeley, and on and on and on and on.
No, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful initiative to hear about. Tell us a little bit. I found it really refreshing when you told me about where you're living and what you found, what your initial impressions are of downtown South Bend and how the city is moving, and your commute to work each day. I'd love for everybody to hear a little bit about your reflections on that.
I'm very proud of what my wife partner, Liz Moll, and I did in Pasadena for 30 years. When I first moved to Pasadena 40 years ago, I bought a house for $30,000. And it is now worth $1.4 million. I'm telling you all of this. I don't own it, unfortunately. But I'm telling the story because everybody walks into Southern California at this point and says, my goodness, what a wonderful world. Well, 40 years ago, there were 90 first stage smog alerts in Pasadena, and the place was up for a fire sale. It was a mess. And it took 30 or 40 years of concerted, economic, administrative, design, institutional work to settle the place down and to make it into a beautiful place. And it is really a beautiful place and set up to care for itself. So I enter the possibility of living in South Bend. And I thought to myself, well, I'm going to be here for 5 to 10 years, and I really want to see certain things happen. So instead of actually living in the suburbs, I'm going to throw myself right in the heart of the cauldron, and I'm going to live downtown, and I'm going to be part of its regeneration. So I found a wonderful apartment overlooking the river, and I thought to myself, now it's going to be trouble because I'm going to have to walk everywhere, right? I'm going to have to get in my car to sneeze and get some Kleenex. I have to get into a car. So 1 week later, I've discovered there are 3 farmers markets, haircut, um, a beautiful wine store, 2 bars, 5 restaurants on one side and 6 on the other, um, and my dry cleaners within walking distance of my apartment. So in 5 months, 4.5 months of living in South Bend since August 1, I've put 420 miles in my car. I basically walk to the university once in a while. I mostly drive because I'm short of time, but the city is regenerating in front of our very eyes. It's becoming a beautiful place to live, and people are buying houses on the East Bank, and people are building new buildings. And in 10 years, we're going to be in awe of what has happened in South Bend. For one thing, most people take it for granted, but when I take my car or I walk up the hill towards South Bend and I hit Notre Dame Avenue and break into the second half of my trek from Colfax to the university, the 150 buildings have been built in the Northeast neighborhood, and also Eddy Street is one of the finest projects of its kind in the United States. The houses are superb. Eddy Street is fine. It's not the best project anywhere, but the houses are. They are remarkably sited. They're remarkably designed. They're lacking a little bit of landscape here and there, but they are beautiful. And I can see this neighborhood and this attitude towards making neighborhoods and working with institutions in South Bend, like South Bend Heritage and others, to actually enlarge this taking the city back for its citizens, and doing it without needing 10 or 20,000 new families a year, but attracting people from the larger region to come and live and work downtown because it's so incredibly amenable and beautiful.
I can't tell you how encouraging that is to hear, Stefanos, especially coming from someone like you. And I know you said that South Bend is on track to be the kind of next Pasadena, and I know those are bold words, but you believe it firmly. So invest now, buy now, move to South Bend. We can't get the word out broadly enough. This is the time you can get deals. Any closing thoughts, before we end this interview?
Well, I am very excited, and I'm very honored to be part of this institution. Daily, I have to come home at night and take a couple of things off my palate because I believe that time is short and the tasks are huge. I appreciated very, very much the support I've received from everyone, students, faculty, and university, and by extension, the Notre Dame family, of whom I have not unfortunately gotten to know because of the pandemic. But I'm looking very much forward to meeting many of you, and I would love to know what you think of what we're doing, and I would like to have not only your words of encouragement, but also your words of criticism, because criticism is the driving force in the architectural profession. We are the only profession of all the professions that learns by crits. We put our work up and we say, so tell us what we've done right and what we've done wrong. And would love to hear from you. We'd love to know what you think of us. And we'll be working ceaselessly on your behalf. And I'm thankful I'm here. And I'm thankful, by the way, to the football team for winning the Clemson game, because my first post USC game at Notre Dame, and I went with a Notre Dame cap. So I don't have total absolution yet, but I'm on my way, right?
You certainly are. I can't tell you, Stefanos, how excited we are to have you here as a part of this community and in playing such a critical role leading our School of Architecture. I'm very bullish about the future of what's going to happen with the school and the impact that we're going to have on the world under your leadership. So thank you again for being with us and sharing your time and insight with everyone today. I'm sure that many folks will want to follow up with you directly in the months and years ahead. So next week, we want to invite you all back Wednesday at noon Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be joined by Professor Sharon Stack, who is the director of the Harper Cancer Institute here on campus. It should be a very engaging in an emotional conversation next week. And as we always do, please join me from your homes, your workplaces, wherever you are, and we will close with a prayer to Our Lady. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Amen.
Take care, God bless, and go Irish. Thanks again, Stefanos.
Thank you all. Thank you, Lou.